In this video, we're going to take a look at kind of clarifying a little bit, adding some further detail to the elasticity of supply, and then we're going to talk about the different factors that affect how elastic or inelastic a supply or a demand curve is, these kind of determinants of supply and demand elasticity. So when we're looking at supply, there's not a lot of detail to add to what we already know about elasticity. Elasticity is a reaction in. And so we can look at that same sort of thing when we talk about the elasticity of supply. The elasticity of supply is just measuring when price changes, how does quantity supplied react? And remember, quantity supplied is not people purchasing, but it's the production of. And so when the price goes up, we know that quantity supplied goes up. So when price goes up, we know quantity supplied goes up. So the question is, does it go up by a lot or does it only go up by a little? And then all of the same sort of mathematical principles apply and graphing apply to what we already learned about elasticity of demand. If the supply curve is relatively steep, we would call that an inelastic or a relatively inelastic supply curve, right? If the supply curve is very flat, we'll point that to that one. If the supply curve is flat, we would call that elastic. Okay, so those are just kind of two different upward sloping supply curves, one being very flat and one being steeper. And so when we are calculating these things, it's the same idea. We look at the percent change in the quantity supply divided by the percent change in the price. And if the price changes by, let's say, 20%, but the reaction is only 10%, we get 0.5, which would mean that it's inelastic for the supply. So all of the same principles apply. If the price changes by 20% and the reaction is 0%, it equals 0, and this would be perfectly inelastic, right? And we could have elastic, we could have perfectly elastic, we could have unit elastic. All the same sort of things apply for elasticity of supply. And so when we are learning this idea of elasticity, it applies to each of the two curves, supply and demand. The only difference is that elasticity of supply is always positive because they're going in the same direction all the time. But when we look at elasticity of demand, we always look at it in absolute value terms, and so this ends up being positive all the time as well. So the big difference between elasticity of supply and elasticity of demand are the factors that impact how elastic or inelastic something is. Since supply, we're talking about producers, and demand, we're talking about consumers, the factors that influence how elastic or inelastic something is for each one of those two curves are going to be very different. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at these two things kind of side by side. We'll look at supply first, and then we'll look at demand. So what factors would influence the supply to be able to change dramatically or not be able to change very much if price changes? So if price goes up, what would limit my ability to increase the quantity supplied? Or what would make it very easy to increase the quantity supplied? Okay, so the first one, what we're going to look at is time, right? So in the short run, I cannot change the quantity that I supplied very much. So in the short run, the quantity supplied is very inelastic because I don't have a lot of time to react to a price change. But in the long run, I'm going to be able to change the quantity supplied a lot more. So it becomes more elastic in the long run. Okay. For supply, there's not a lot of them. So for supply, that besides time, it's really complexity. Right. So is the production process very complex? Is it very technical? Does it, or even does it is the process lengthy? Okay, so we're going to wrap that up in this idea of complexity. So I'm going to give you two examples, all right, that make something very inelastic. And so you can think of it the opposite being elastic. So the first one is technical. Sorry, misspelled technical. All right, it's something very technical. So think of something like, you know, a jumbo jet or a spacecraft or something that's very technical. So even if the price of that good goes up, the complexity, the technical nature of trying to produce it is going to limit my ability just to mass produce a lot more. And so it's going to be very inelastic in the quantity supplied. The other thing is the complexity in how I go about getting more of the natural resources. So I'll give you a really simple one. Orange juice. Would the supply of orange juice be very elastic or inelastic? Well, think of it like this. Can I just snap my fingers and get a lot more oranges? I cannot, right? The complexity of trying to create those is very difficult, and it takes a long period of time. So this one's sort of related to the time factor. It takes a long time for me to get the resources. And so orange juice, the quantity supplied of orange juice would be very inelastic because I can't just get oranges overnight, right? I have to plant the orange groves. I have to harvest over a long period of time. So the complexity of trying to create that resource is very difficult. So those are elasticity of supply. Length of time that I have to react, but then also the complexity of the production process. On the demand side, it has to do with how consumers are influenced or how they're impacted by price changes. And so the first one we look at is this idea of percent of budget, or how much money you're spending on it. And so if you spend a significant, let's say you spend 50% of your income on food, right? And food prices increase. Well, you're going to have to decrease your quantity demanded by a significant portion because you don't have a lot of room to continue to buy food if you spend so much money of your budget on food. But look at it like this. Let's say you only spend like 1% of your income on, let's say coffee, right? And coffee prices go up. Well, since you don't spend a lot of your income on it, it's not going to impact you as much. So even if coffee prices go up, the quantity demanded is only going to go down by a small amount. And so that's inelastic for you. So if you spend a big portion of your budget, it's going to be more elastic. So a small portion of your budget is going to be inelastic. The next one is substitutes. Right? So if there's a lot of alternatives available, right? If the price of this one goes up, I'm just going to buy a different one, right? So if there's lots of substitutes, it means the good is elastic. People aren't going to buy that one if there's a bunch of alternatives available. So lots of substitutes means elastic. If there's only one type of that good that exists, well then I basically have to keep buying it. So it's very inelastic. The next one is whether it's a need or if it's a want, right? If it's a necessity or if it's just a luxury. Okay, so needs are going to be very inelastic. Okay, so I need water or I need a certain medicine, right? I just want a new phone or I want a certain type of soda or something like that. Right? Needs versus wants are going to change how elastic or inelastic something is. And the same as supply, in demand, it's how much time we have to react. So if gas prices go up tomorrow, I still basically need to buy gasoline, right? So it's going to be very inelastic tomorrow. But if gas prices stay high for a really long period of time, I'm going to find alternative methods of transportation. I'm going to take mass transit. I'm going to learn to ride a bike further. All these different things are going to affect elasticity over time. Okay? So these are different determinants of elasticity.